It's
Okay.
challenging.
Question from Munzer. Is there an easy way to use texture paint in Blender to paint a metallic color or some other paint that involves more than one texture? Jenny says, I use Substance Painter. Munzer says, I try not to use Substance Painter. Jan says, I use Substance Painter too. Mikey says,
Yes. So when it comes to multiple textures, one of the challenging things to remember is to make sure you've got the right texture selected when you start doing your painting, because it's very, very easy to forget about switching it and you end up painting on the wrong layer. Blender by default is a bit lacking behind when it comes to its texture paint mode, and trying to set up a layered approach is quite challenging because you have to manually go in and select the texture that you're painting on. Now, when you say metallic color, I presume you're actually just talking there about whether something's metal or not, whether it's metal or dielectric.
yeah, there's because you could also mean pearlescent, which is a different effect.
Yeah. When it comes to a PBR workflow, so physically based rendering, you also get MPR as well. I think is the opposite, not physically
That's
based.
talk radio, isn't it?
I don't know. Uh, maybe. So you get physically based rendering, which a lot of game engines are all set up to do. So when it comes to that, you have an albedo, which is the color of your surface. No light involved here. It's the color of the surface, so there's no shadows or anything else. So in fact, I'm going to bring up the shading workspace in Blender just so I've got my thing. So Blender calls this the base color. It's sometimes known as the albedo, and sometimes it's called diffuse. It's the basic color of the surface. And remember that when we talk about a material, we're talking about how that surface interacts with light. So, what's the desired response from it? When it comes to the next one down that a lot of things have with their PBR workflow is metallic. Now, in the olden days, it's still a thing you can do today. You would have a specular workflow, and these days you have a metallic and roughness workflow. A specular and something, I can't remember what it is. They're almost a substitute for one another. Oh, but it's not a one for one replacement. If you're doing something that's supposed to be physically accurate, then you either have a metallic surface or not. Obviously, you can say this part of the surface when you're texture painting is metallic and this bit is not. That's absolutely fine. But there's no such thing as a halfway when it comes to whether a surface is metallic or not, because it's a physically it's how physics works. I can't remember. I used to know the detail of the difference between a dielectric surface and a metallic surface, something to do with electrons and how they interact with the light interacting with the surface. So that's important. That typically a metallic map will be black and white. It will not have grayscale on it. It can do for artistic license, but if you're being true in terms of physically based rendering, you won't have that. Roughness is another one. That's a grayscale. If possible, things like roughness would be great if you had them not as an 8-bit image, but as a higher bit rate image, probably 16, because then you can have a smoother gradient between where things are rough and where they're not.
I have a question for you that just I meant to ask a couple of weeks back, but I forgot. With regards to metallic and specular,
Yeah.
if you're using an image for both of these,
Yeah.
is it a bad idea to set the metallic to be the alpha channel of the specular?
It depends on your engine and whether or not you can extract that information. So if your game engine doesn't support the fact that you've imported it as an RGB image or an
Hmm.
RGBA image, and you can't
Then you should be
break
using
out.
Godot. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, for instance, it's quite common for the ambient occlusion, the metallic, and the roughness to be baked into an RGB image and used. And so you have two textures. You have the color information, and then you have another RGB image that contains the roughness, the metallicity, and the what's the other one I just said? The ambient occlusion. Now, ambient occlusion doesn't exist on the principled BSDF shader node in Blender. That's because Blender doesn't need to fake ambient occlusion, and it's a toggle you can turn on elsewhere. But in Game Engine, it's often used to help shadow certain areas. Um, Now, painting your albedo and metallic at the same time doesn't make much sense.
Right, because that's very different information.
Yeah,
Metallic would be, is this a metal?
yeah,
It's a yes or no question. And as you were saying earlier, you can kind of get around it, but that's not what it's for. Albedo is what are the colors on each pixel
yeah.
or texel, if we're going to be accurate about it.
Or if you're talking about the texture itself, then it's just the
Now, what
pixel.
you can do, and I know you don't want to use this, you want to use Blender, but if you're using something
Yep.
like Substance Painter or Mixer or whatever else, you can create a texture and then assign that to a
Yeah.
paintbrush and then just paint detail of that metal or those scratches or whatever else it
Yeah,
is.
and because of the way that's set up, your paintbrush has different channels to it, which
Mhm.
it then assigns, oh, well, if this thing I'm painting here is metal and it's this color, do this. So,
Yeah. So one of the easiest things you could do is say, okay, there's a new layer. On this layer, I'm using a paintbrush, and this paintbrush has this height information. So we're scoring into it, and it's going to be more metallic and a different color, and it's going to look like we've scratched the paint on the car.
yeah, exactly. I have a mesh, not metallic, and I want to draw some decoration. So you'll need to, first of all, UV unwrap it. Even if you're taking it outside of Blender to do
Mhm.
this work, you're going to have to UV unwrap it. Now, remember, um, or a word of caution, you can help speed up your workflow if you've got a mirrored UV setup, so you only have to paint on one side and it comes out the other. But if you're using something like text, that will not work unless your text can also be mirrored. And sometimes you don't want uniform detail across left
Yeah.
and right parts of your model. So just bear that in mind. One of
Especially if you're baking shadows in.
Yeah, if the moment you have a reflected mesh like that with a reflected UV, you can't use it for lighting information. You'd need to. You can have a different UV. You can unwrap more than once, so you can balance those things out as well. To paint the decoration, I'd literally create a texture, plug it. Well, let's do it. Let's do it. Let's go ahead. Main screen. Excellent. You guys can see that. So we have here our cube or whatever, and the base color. Let's lower it a little so we've got a sort of so just presume this has a texture plugged into it and it's just grey. And then we want some areas of it that are going to be metallic. So we bring this out. Blender by default will assume that you're using UV. So at this point, I can just pop in an image texture. So I'm going to search for this and go to image texture color. And then you would have an input going in here. So I'm going to create a new texture. This is the one I'm going to paint my detail on. And I'm going to call this metal, rock, etc. Now, black means not metallic. So that's fine as a starting image. And there we go. So this looks exactly the same as it did before. But if I go ahead now and open up, making sure that I'm on the metal layer, this is what I was saying earlier. It's important to recognize. In the viewport here, we're going to see what we're painting. And so I can come in. I don't have my stylus plugged in at the moment. So we can just do this. I don't know what face I was writing on. Anyway, it's here. And of course, you can do it here as well. I would recommend a stylus for this, by the way. So if you did want to do some fancy squiggles or whatever it was you were doing, you can do it a bit more precisely. In the shading workspace now, we've got this, which is the metal layer saying this part is metallic and this part is not. It's pretty much as straightforward as that. Does that make sense? I hope so.
Makes sense to me.